Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change a life. Stories like this remind us that even the smallest act of compassion can create ripples far beyond what we can imagine. The coldest nights don't always reveal who is suffering. They reveal who is still willing to care. The wind coming off the harbor felt like a knife against my cheeks as I stepped out of Harbor Bean Café at 9:43 on a Thursday night. My shift had ended 20 minutes earlier, but Denise had needed help closing, and saying no had never been one of my talents. I pulled my worn cream-colored coat tighter around my body and checked my bank account for the third time that evening. $18.42. That was everything. Everything between me and next Friday. Everything between my little brother Caleb and another week without worrying too much. The screen glowed in my hand before I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Snow drifted across the ferry terminal parking lot in slow white spirals. Most people hurried past with their heads down, eager to get home. I understood that feeling. Home wasn't much. A small apartment above an old hardware store. Drafty windows. A heater that made strange noises. Bills stacked on the kitchen counter like unwelcome guests. But it was ours. And after losing our mother 6 years ago, it was the only place that still felt safe. I started walking toward the bus stop when something caught my attention near a bench facing the water. At first I thought it was a pile of blankets. Then the shape moved. An elderly woman sat alone beneath the dim yellow glow of a street lamp. Her hands trembled around a paper cup. Snow dusted her silver hair. She wore a thin cardigan that looked completely useless against the 20-degree wind. People passed her. Dozens of them. Nobody stopped. Nobody even looked. I slowed. My feet kept moving for another few steps before guilt wrapped around my chest. Because I knew exactly what would happen if I stopped. I knew what it would cost me. The coat on my shoulders wasn't fashionable. It wasn't expensive. But it was warm. And it was the only winter coat I owned. I closed my eyes for a second, then turned around. The woman looked up as I approached. Her pale blue eyes seemed surprised that anyone had noticed her. "Ma'am," I said softly. "Are you okay?" She smiled, but it looked tired. "I'm fine, dear." The kind of answer people give when they don't want to be a burden. The wind blew harder. I saw her shoulders shake. That settled it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I slipped off my coat and draped it around her shoulders. The woman stared at me. "No, sweetheart. You need this. You need it more. What about you?" I laughed quietly even though my stomach was already tightening from the cold. "I'll survive." Her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite understand. Gratitude maybe. Or sadness. She reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. "Most people don't stop anymore." I shrugged. "Maybe they're just having a hard day." "And what about you?" she asked. For a moment I thought about the bills. The rent. The fear I carried every morning. Then I smiled. "I'm having a hard day too." The woman looked at me for a long moment as snow continued to fall around us. Then she whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "Kindness always comes home, Savannah." My heart skipped. I had never told her my name. I stood there frozen as the old woman released my hand. The wind howled across the harbor, carrying the smell of salt water and snow. My heart still raced from what she had said. "Kindness always comes home, Savannah." She knew my name. I was certain I had never introduced myself. "Have we met before?" I asked. The woman smiled softly, but instead of answering, she pulled my coat tighter around her shoulders. "You should get home, dear. Someone is waiting for you." Caleb. The thought hit me immediately. My little brother would be wondering where I was. I glanced toward the road for only a second. When I looked back, the woman was already walking away through the falling snow. Something about the moment felt strange. Not frightening. Just impossible to explain. I hurried to the bus stop, trying to convince myself there was a simple answer. Maybe she had heard someone call my name earlier. Maybe I was overthinking everything because I was exhausted. By the time I reached our apartment building, my fingers were numb from the cold. The stairwell smelled faintly of old paint and dust. When I opened the door to apartment 3B, warm yellow light spilled into the hallway. Caleb sat at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks. "You are late," he said without looking up. You sound like an 80-year-old landlord. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. Then he finally looked at me and frowned. Where is your coat? I dropped into the chair across from him. Long story. Did you lose it? No. Did you sell it? No. Then what happened? I told him about the woman at the ferry terminal. As I spoke, his expression softened. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head. You gave away the only warm coat you own. Apparently. Savannah. I know. He sighed dramatically. You are impossible. I laughed, but a sudden chill ran through me. The apartment felt colder than usual. My throat hurt. My head felt heavy. Caleb noticed immediately. You are getting sick. I am fine. That means you are definitely getting sick. He stood and disappeared into the kitchen. A moment later he returned with a mug of tea. It was not very good tea. Caleb had never mastered the art of cooking anything. But the gesture warmed me anyway. I wrapped my hands around the mug and watched the steam rise toward the ceiling. For a few minutes, everything felt peaceful. Then my eyes landed on the stack of envelopes sitting beside the refrigerator. Utility bill. Rent reminder. Medical payment from last year. Reality waiting patiently for me. My stomach tightened. Tomorrow was another shift. Another day of smiling through worry. Another day of pretending everything was under control. Later that night, after Caleb had gone to bed, I stood by the window looking out over the snow-covered street. The town looked quiet. Almost magical. Then I noticed something unusual. Across the street, beneath a flickering streetlight, a black sedan sat parked with its headlights off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe someone was visiting a neighbor. Yet for some reason, I could not shake the feeling that someone inside was watching our building. And when the sedan finally pulled away, a strange uneasiness settled deep in my chest. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I had swallowed sandpaper. Every muscle in my body ached. Pale winter sunlight pushed through the apartment window, turning the frost on the glass into tiny crystals. For a moment I considered calling in sick. Then I remembered my bank account. $18.42 had become $12.87 after buying groceries 2 days earlier. Sick days were a luxury I could not afford. By 7:30, I was standing behind the counter at Harbor Bean Café, forcing a smile while the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. The morning rush had already started. Construction workers, teachers, ferry passengers carrying briefcases and paper cups. Normal people living normal lives. I envied them more than I wanted to admit. You look terrible, Denise said as she loaded pastries into the display case. Thank you. That is exactly what every woman wants to hear before breakfast. She rolled her eyes. You need rest. I need rent money. That ended the discussion. Around 10 o'clock business slowed. I was wiping down tables when the front door opened and a burst of cold air swept through the cafe. A delivery driver stepped inside carrying a large cream-colored envelope. Savannah Reed? He asked. I froze. That is me. This was left for you. He handed it over and immediately walked back outside. No signature. No return address. Just my name written in elegant handwriting across the front. Denise appeared beside me almost instantly. What is it? I have no idea. My fingers hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a single folded card made from thick ivory paper. The message contained only 6 words. Thank you for seeing her yesterday. I stared at the note. My heartbeat quickened. Denise read it over my shoulder. Who is her? I already knew. The elderly woman from the ferry terminal. The strange woman who somehow knew my name. The woman who had disappeared into the snow. I think I know, I whispered. Tucked behind the card was something else. A photograph. My breath caught. It showed the ferry terminal from the previous night. The image had been taken from a distance. There I was, standing beside the bench, placing my coat around the elderly woman's shoulders. Snow drifted between us like white sparks frozen in time. Someone had photographed the moment. My stomach tightened. Denise looked just as confused. Who took this? I do not know. That is not creepy at all. I tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak. As she was right. The picture should have frightened me. Yet somehow it did not. Looking at it felt different. Like whoever had taken it wanted to preserve the moment rather than exploit it. Still, one question refused to leave my mind. Why? The answer arrived less than an hour later. Outside the cafe window, 3 black luxury vehicles slowly pulled up along the curb. Every conversation inside seemed to fade. People noticed. People stared. The vehicles looked expensive enough to buy half the buildings on our street. The center car stopped directly in front of Harbor Bean Café. A man stepped out. Tall. Broad shoulders. Dark overcoat. The kind of presence that changed the atmosphere before he even entered a room. Through the glass, I watched him lift his eyes toward the cafe. Toward me. And for reasons I could not explain, I suddenly knew that whatever had started at the ferry terminal the night before was about to change my life forever. The cafe door opened, and the room seemed to inhale all at once. Conversations faded. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting hands. Even Denise stopped moving. The man who entered looked like he belonged to a different world entirely. He was tall, probably 6'3", with dark hair brushed neatly back and a charcoal overcoat that fit with effortless precision. Yet it was not his clothes that drew attention. It was the quiet certainty in the way he carried himself. The kind of confidence that did not need to announce itself. His eyes swept across the cafe once before settling on me. My stomach tightened immediately. He walked forward unhurried, while 2 other men remained near the entrance. They were not intimidating. They simply watched everything with unusual focus. The stranger stopped in front of the counter. Close, he looked older than I first thought. Maybe 35. His expression was controlled, but there was something tired behind his eyes. Something human. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he glanced at the photograph still resting beside my register. His gaze lingered on the image of the ferry terminal, on the coat, on the elderly woman. Finally he looked back at me. Savannah Reed? His voice was calm and surprisingly gentle. Yes. He nodded once. My name is Nolan Mercer. The name hit the room before it hit me. I heard someone whisper near the window. Another customer nearly dropped a spoon. Denise's eyes widened. Apparently everyone knew exactly who he was except me. Nolan noticed my confusion. A faint smile touched one corner of his mouth. That reaction is refreshing. I swallowed. Should I know who you are? A few customers openly stared. Nolan seemed amused. Most people around here do. I felt my cheeks warm. Sorry. Do not be. His eyes softened slightly. Actually, it is one of the reasons I wanted to meet you. The words only made me more confused. Why? His gaze shifted briefly toward the photograph again. Because 2 nights ago, you stopped when everyone else kept walking. The cafe became impossibly quiet. I remembered the elderly woman sitting alone beneath the street lamp. The snow. The trembling hands wrapped around a paper cup. Slowly, understanding began to form. She is related to you. Nolan nodded. She is my mother. For a second I forgot how to breathe. Every strange detail from the past 24 hours suddenly rearranged itself. The note. The photograph. The feeling that someone had been watching. She talked about you all morning, he continued. That does not happen often. I looked down at the counter. I only gave her a coat. No. His voice became quieter. You gave her dignity. The words landed somewhere deep inside me. Because nobody had ever thanked me like that before. Nobody had ever looked at a small act and treated it like it mattered. Nolan reached into his coat pocket and removed another envelope. He placed it gently on the counter between us. I immediately shook my head. I do not want money. His eyes narrowed slightly, studying me. Then he surprised me by pushing the envelope back toward himself. Good. Relief washed through me. Until his next sentence. Because there is no money inside. Something in his expression changed. Not darker. More serious. Then what is it? Nolan looked directly into my eyes. Information. Every instinct told me that whatever was inside that envelope was far more important than money. And when he finally opened it, revealing a single photograph, my heart nearly stopped. It was another picture of the ferry terminal. Another picture of me and his mother. Except this time, there was someone else standing in the background watching us from the shadows. I stared at the photograph for several seconds before I realized I had stopped breathing. The image showed the ferry terminal exactly as I remembered it. The snow, the bench, the elderly woman wrapped in my coat, me standing beside her. But near the edge of the frame, partially hidden beneath the awning of a closed bait shop, stood another figure. The person's face was impossible to make out, only a dark silhouette watching from a distance. Watching us. A chill moved through me that had nothing to do with winter. "Who is that?" I asked quietly. Nolan folded his hands in front of him. "That is what I am trying to find out." I looked up. "You do not know?" "If I did, I would not be standing here." Something in his voice told me he was being honest. Around us, the cafe slowly resumed its normal rhythm. Customers returned to conversations. Coffee machines hissed. Cups clinked against saucers. Yet it felt as if Nolan and I existed inside a separate bubble of silence. I studied the photograph again. "Why would someone watch your mother?" Nolan's jaw tightened slightly. "My mother is well known in certain circles." I almost laughed. "You say that like it explains everything." A surprising warmth appeared in his eyes. "Fair point." He glanced toward the window where snow continued to drift across the street. "The truth is, my family attracts attention." I remembered the black sedan parked outside my apartment the night before. A memory that suddenly felt much less harmless. Was somebody watching me too? The question escaped before I could stop it. Nolan looked directly at me. He did not answer immediately, which frightened me more than any response could have. "Possibly," he finally admitted. My stomach sank. "Why?" "Because you became connected to my mother." I shook my head. "I gave her a coat. You gave her kindness." His voice softened. "To some people that matters more than you realize." I looked down at the photograph again. Nothing about my life felt important enough to attract strangers with cameras. I worked at a cafe. I paid bills. I worried about my brother's future. That was it. Yet somehow the simple decision to stop and help someone had pulled me into a situation I did not understand. Nolan carefully placed the photograph back inside the envelope. "You do not need to worry." That is exactly what people say right before someone starts worrying. For the first time, an actual smile appeared. It transformed his face completely. Less distant. Less intimidating. Almost human. "You are very direct." "I work with the public. It happens." The smile lingered for another second before fading. "My mother would like to see you." I blinked. "What?" "She has not stopped talking about you." "I barely know her." "That has never stopped her before." Despite myself, I laughed. The sound surprised both of us. Then Nolan reached into his coat pocket once more and handed me a small cream-colored card. An address was written neatly across the front. Nothing else. No company logo. No explanation. "Think about it," he said. "No pressure." He stepped back from the counter. The two men near the entrance immediately straightened. Nolan paused before leaving and looked at me one last time. "Savannah." "Yes." His expression became unexpectedly serious. "Do not walk home alone tonight." Before I could ask another question, he turned and walked out into the falling snow, leaving me standing there with an address in one hand and a growing feeling that my ordinary life was beginning to disappear. That evening, the address sat in my coat pocket like a question. I could not stop asking myself. I must have checked the card 20 times during my shift. The handwriting was simple, elegant. The address belonged to a property on the northern cliffs overlooking the harbor. Everyone in town knew that area. People drove past the gates and wondered what life looked like behind them. People like me certainly did not receive invitations to visit. By the time I finished work, the sky had already darkened. Snow reflected the glow of streetlights, turning the sidewalk silver. Denise caught me staring at the card again. "You are going." It was not a question. "I have not decided." "Yes, you have." I sighed. "Maybe." She folded her arms. "A mysterious invitation from one of the most powerful men on the coast, and you are considering saying no?" "That is exactly why I am considering saying no." Denise laughed. "Call me later. If you disappear into a secret underground society, I want updates." 30 minutes later, I was sitting on a bus climbing the winding road toward the cliffs. My stomach twisted tighter with every mile. Outside the window, enormous homes appeared between snow-covered trees. Properties that looked more like private resorts than houses. Wealth on a scale I had only seen in magazines. I suddenly became very aware of my second-hand boots and the sweater I had owned for 4 years. The bus finally stopped. My hands felt cold despite the heater. I stepped onto the sidewalk and stared. The property was breathtaking. Iron gates stood open beneath stone pillars. Warm golden lights glowed beyond them. Not flashy, not extravagant, just quietly beautiful. For several seconds I considered turning around. Then I remembered the old woman at the ferry terminal. Eleanor Mercer. The woman who had smiled at me as if we were old friends. Before I could lose my nerve, I walked through the gates. The front door opened before I reached it. An older housekeeper greeted me with a kind smile. "Miss Reed, we have been expecting you." That sentence alone nearly made me turn around again. Instead, I followed her inside. Warm air wrapped around me immediately. The entrance hall smelled faintly of cedar wood and fresh bread. Not expensive. Perfume. Not polished marble. Felt strangely lived in. Comfortable. Like a family home. The housekeeper led me through a sunlit sitting room where a fire crackled softly inside a stone fireplace. And there she was. Eleanor Mercer sat in a high-backed chair near the fire. The cream-colored coat I had given her rested neatly across her lap. The moment she saw me, her face brightened. "Savannah." Before I could say anything, she stood and crossed the room surprisingly quickly for someone her age. Then she wrapped both hands around mine. "I was hoping you would come." I found myself smiling despite my nerves. "You seem much warmer than the last time I saw you." She laughed softly. "That is because a certain stubborn young woman gave me her coat." For a few minutes we talked as if we had known each other for years. About the weather, the harbor, Caleb, the café. The conversation felt effortless, natural. Yet one question remained in the back of my mind. Finally, I glanced around the room. "Where is Nolan?" Eleanor's smile became mysterious. She looked toward the doorway behind me. "Right behind you, dear." And the moment I turned around, I realized I was not the only one who had been curious about this meeting. I turned around and nearly collided with him. Nolan Mercer stood in the doorway with one hand resting lightly against the frame. For a second, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly behind me. Snow drifted past the tall windows. Everything felt strangely still. Nolan's gaze moved from his mother to me before a hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. "You look disappointed." I blinked. "What?" "Most people expect something more dramatic when they visit this house." I glanced around the room. "I do not know." Secret tunnels. A private helicopter. A throne. Eleanor laughed so hard she had to dab her eyes with a napkin. Even Nolan looked momentarily caught off guard. "A throne," he repeated. "You never know." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I am afraid we are disappointingly normal." "I am beginning to suspect that is not true." His expression softened. "Fair observation." The housekeeper appeared carrying a tray of tea and pastries. Within minutes, all three of us were seated near the fireplace. The warmth finally began to drive the lingering cold from my bones. For the first time since arriving, I allowed myself to relax. Eleanor seemed delighted by everything. Every story. Every question. Every small detail. She asked about Caleb. She asked about the café. She asked about my mother. When I spoke about losing her, Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Grief changes people," she said softly. "It teaches you what truly matters." The room fell silent for a moment. I noticed Nolan looking into the fire. His expression had become distant, thoughtful, almost sad. Something about it made me wonder what losses he carried. Eleanor eventually excused herself to take a phone call. The moment she disappeared down the hallway, an entirely different silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar. Nolan poured more tea into my cup. "My mother likes you." I smiled. "I noticed. That is rare. She seems pretty friendly." He shook his head. "Not like this." I looked down at the steam rising from my tea. "I only helped someone who looked cold." "You keep saying that." "Because it is true." Nolan studied me for several seconds. Most people saw an elderly woman sitting alone in the snow. And you saw a person. I looked away first. Compliments had always made me uncomfortable, especially sincere ones. To change the subject, I glanced toward the large bookshelf lining one wall. Hundreds of books filled the shelves. History, architecture, business, literature. You actually read all of those? I asked. Most of them. That is mildly intimidating. I can recommend easier ones. That sounded insulting. The faint smile returned. It was not intended that way. We were both laughing quietly when a knock sounded at the front door somewhere deeper in the house. The mood changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Nolan's attention shifted toward the hallway. One of the staff members appeared moments later carrying a sealed envelope. He handed it directly to Nolan before leaving. I watched as Nolan opened it. The warmth disappeared from his face. His eyes scanned the page once, then again. Every instinct in my body tightened. Something was wrong. Nolan folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Is everything okay? I asked. For a second it seemed like he might avoid the question. Instead he looked directly at me. Someone has been asking questions about you, Savannah. The teacup nearly slipped from my hands. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. The fire continued to crackle softly. Snow tapped against the tall windows. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed the hour. Everything felt normal except for the sentence Nolan had just spoken. Someone has been asking questions about you. I slowly set my teacup down on the table. Questions. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. Nolan nodded once. Nothing alarming. That is not what your face says. A brief shadow crossed his expression. You notice more than most people. That is usually what happens when someone tells you strangers are investigating your life. For several seconds he seemed to consider his next words carefully. The person has been making inquiries about your work schedule, your apartment building, and your family. My stomach tightened immediately. My family. Your brother. Every protective instinct inside me woke up at once. Caleb was the only family I had left. The only person who mattered more than myself. Who is asking? I demanded. We do not know yet. You keep saying we. Nolan leaned back slightly. Because my security team is looking into it. I stared at him. You have a security team investigating my life? Only after someone else started first. I opened my mouth then closed it again. Part of me wanted to be angry. Another part knew he was probably trying to help. The problem was that my life had never included security teams, investigations, or mysterious photographs. My biggest concern a week ago had been paying the electric bill on time. Eleanor returned to the room before I could say anything else. The moment she saw my expression, concern appeared in her eyes. What happened? Nolan answered before I could. Nothing that cannot be handled. Eleanor gave him a look that suggested she had been dealing with his version of reassurance for decades. That means something happened. Surprisingly, Nolan almost smiled. Mother. Nolan. They stared at each other for several seconds. I suddenly understood exactly where he had learned his stubbornness. Eleanor sat beside me and gently squeezed my hand. You do not need to worry, dear. I wanted to believe her. I really did. Yet worry was already settling deep inside my chest. The rest of the evening passed in a strange blur. Eleanor insisted I stay for dinner. I tried refusing twice. She ignored me twice. By the time we sat around the dining table, I found myself listening to stories about Nolan as a teenager. Stories that clearly embarrassed him. Stories that made him seem less like an untouchable public figure and more like a real person. I learned he once tried to build a sailboat that sank before it left the dock. I learned he hated public speaking despite his reputation. I even learned he had been terrible at cooking. Was? Eleanor asked. He is still terrible. For the first time all evening I laughed without forcing it. The tension eased. Just a little. Yet later, as dinner ended and I prepared to leave, the uneasy feeling returned. Nolan walked me to the front entrance. Outside, snow continued falling beneath the glow of lantern lights. The world looked peaceful. Too peaceful. He handed me a folded piece of paper. What is this? I asked. A phone number. Yours. Direct line. I looked up at him. You expect me to call? His eyes held mine. Calm. Serious. If anything feels unusual, yes. Before I could respond, headlights appeared beyond the gates. A dark vehicle had stopped outside the property. Not moving. Just waiting. And for the second time that week, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. The ride home felt longer than usual. Snowflakes drifted across the windshield, while the driver followed the winding road down from the cliffs. I sat quietly in the back seat, Nolan's phone number folded inside my pocket. Every few minutes I found myself looking through the glass toward the dark vehicle that had been parked outside the gates. By the time we left the property, it was gone. Maybe it had never meant anything. Maybe I was allowing my imagination to run wild. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. When I finally reached my apartment building, the lights in our kitchen window were still on. Relief loosened something inside my chest. Caleb was home. Safe. Normal. Exactly what I needed. The moment I opened the door, the smell of burnt toast greeted me. Please tell me that is not dinner, I called out. Caleb looked up from the kitchen and rolled his eyes. It was supposed to be grilled cheese. I laughed despite everything. You have somehow offended both bread and cheese. Very supportive. For the next hour, life felt ordinary again. We ate takeout from the diner down the street. Caleb complained about school. I complained about customers who ordered coffee and then forgot to pick it up. The familiar rhythm settled my nerves. Then my phone buzzed. The sound seemed unusually loud inside the apartment. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. My stomach tightened immediately. You are not answering? Caleb asked. I do not know who it is. The phone stopped ringing. 10 seconds later, a text message arrived. No greeting. No signature. Just a single sentence. Be careful who you trust. I stared at the words. A cold sensation spread through my chest. Caleb noticed my expression instantly. What happened? I turned the screen off. Nothing. He narrowed his eyes. That was definitely not a nothing face. Just work stuff. The lie sounded weak even to me. Later that night, after Caleb went to sleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the message. Be careful who you trust. The words could have come from anyone. A prank. A mistake. Yet deep down I knew it was connected to everything that had happened during the past few days. The elderly woman. The photographs. The questions. Nolan. My eyes drifted toward the folded piece of paper resting beside my mug. His direct phone number. I had no intention of using it. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Then another message appeared. This one included a photograph. My breath caught instantly. It was a picture of Harbor Bean Café, taken earlier that morning. Through the front window, I could clearly see myself standing behind the register. Whoever sent it had been there, watching. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen. For several seconds I debated what to do. Then, before fear could talk me out of it, I reached for Nolan's number and pressed call. The line rang once, twice. Then his voice appeared immediately. Calm. Awake. As if he had been expecting the call. Savannah, he said. Tell me what happened. And somehow hearing him say my name made me realize just how frightened I had become. The line remained silent for less than a second. Savannah, Nolan repeated, his voice steady and focused. Tell me exactly what you received. I swallowed and looked at the photograph again. My reflection stared back from the dark phone screen between glances at the image. Someone sent me a picture of the cafe. It was taken this morning. The silence on the other end changed. Not longer. Sharper. And the message? It said I should be careful who I trust. I heard a quiet exhale. Send both to me. You already know who it is, do not you? Another pause. I have suspicions. That answer did not make me feel any better. I forwarded the messages while he stayed on the line. My apartment suddenly felt smaller than usual. The old refrigerator hummed in the corner. Snow tapped softly against the kitchen window. Caleb slept down the hall completely unaware that our normal life seemed to be slipping away one strange event at a time. A notification sounded on Nolan's end. He had received the files. Several seconds passed. The photograph was taken from across the street, he said. The angle confirms that. Can you identify the person? Not yet. Frustration tightened my chest. I do not understand why any of this is happening. His voice softened slightly. Neither do I. But I intend to find out. The certainty in those words calmed me more than I wanted to admit. We spoke for another few minutes before the conversation shifted. How is Caleb? He asked unexpectedly. I blinked. Asleep. Why? You talk about him every time something worries you. I looked toward the hallway. He is all I have left. The answer came out quieter than I intended. Nolan did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an understanding that surprised me. I know that feeling. For a brief moment, neither of us said anything. Two people sitting in different buildings beneath the same winter sky, connected by losses neither of us fully discussed. Eventually he cleared his throat. I want you to do something for me tomorrow. That sounds suspiciously like an order. A request. Slightly better. I could almost hear the hint of a smile. Take the day off. I laughed immediately. Absolutely not. Savannah. Rent exists. I am serious. And I am serious too. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes before he finally gave up trying to convince me. When the call ended, I felt strangely lighter. Not because my problems had disappeared. They had not. But because for the first time I was not carrying them completely alone. The next morning arrived with clear skies and fresh snow. Harbor Bean Café filled quickly with customers escaping the cold. I threw myself into work, determined to reclaim some sense of normalcy. Around 11:30, the front door opened and a man I had never seen before stepped inside. He wore an expensive navy coat and carried a leather portfolio beneath one arm. He walked directly toward the counter. Savannah Reed? He asked. My stomach immediately tightened. Yes. He offered a polite smile. My name is Vincent Hale. The name meant nothing to me. What he said next changed that instantly. I recently purchased the building where you and your brother live. My heart dropped. And we need to discuss your future there. For a moment I simply stared at him. The sounds of the cafe faded into the background. The coffee machine hissed. Someone laughed near the window. A chair scraped across the floor. Yet all I could hear was the sentence repeating inside my head. I recently purchased the building where you and your brother live. Vincent Hale stood calmly on the other side of the counter, as if he had just commented on the weather. His smile remained perfectly polite, perfectly controlled. That somehow made me more nervous. I am sorry, I said slowly. What exactly does that have to do with me? Vincent opened the leather portfolio and removed several documents. The property is scheduled for redevelopment. My stomach dropped. Redevelopment. The building is older than expected. Significant renovations will be required. I already knew what was coming. The moment before bad news arrives always feels the same. Quiet. Heavy. Unavoidable. Vincent slid one page across the counter. Tenants will need to vacate within 60 days. 60 days. I stared at the number. 60 days to find a new apartment in a town where rent prices had doubled in the past 3 years. 60 days to move everything Caleb and I owned. 60 days to somehow afford a future I could barely afford now. There must be some mistake, I whispered. Vincent's expression softened slightly. I understand this is difficult. No, he did not understand. If he understood, he would know that some people did not have savings accounts large enough to absorb surprises. Some people balanced entire lives on a few dollars and careful planning. Excuse me, I said quietly. I stepped away from the register and disappeared into the small employee hallway behind the kitchen. The moment the door closed, I pressed both hands against the wall and closed my eyes. My chest felt tight. Not because of anger. Because of fear. Caleb. School. Rent. The electric bill. Everything I had spent years holding together suddenly felt fragile. Denise found me 2 minutes later. What happened? She asked immediately. I handed her the notice. Her eyes widened. Oh no. That simple reaction somehow made everything feel more real. I do not know what to do, I admitted. Denise wrapped one arm around my shoulder. You will figure it out. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But hope felt expensive these days. When I finally returned to the counter, Vincent was still waiting. "Miss Reed," he said gently, "I am willing to discuss options." I looked at him carefully. Something felt off. Not threatening, just strange. Almost as if he wanted me to react a certain way. "Why are you personally delivering notices?" I asked. A flicker crossed his expression. Gone almost instantly.
I prefer handling.
Important matters directly. The answer sounded rehearsed. Before I could ask another question, my phone vibrated. I glanced down. Nolan Mercer. Somehow that made my heart beat faster. Vincent noticed the name on the screen. For the first time since arriving, his smile disappeared completely. Just for a second. Then it returned. Polite. Controlled. Interesting. Very interesting. I answered the call. "Hello." Nolan's voice came through immediately. "Where are you?" "At work." "Good. Stay there." My grip tightened around the phone. "Why?" A pause followed. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Because Vincent Hale did not buy your building for business reasons, Savannah. He bought it because of you." My hand tightened around the phone. For several seconds I forgot that Vincent Hale was standing only a few feet away. Forgot about the customers. Forgot about the cafe. There was only Nolan's voice and the sentence echoing inside my head. "He bought it because of you." What does that mean? I asked quietly. On the other end of the line, Nolan sounded unusually serious. "It means the building was never the objective." A cold sensation settled deep in my chest. "Then what was?" "You." I looked up. Vincent stood calmly near the counter, waiting with the patience of someone completely confident in the outcome. The sight made my stomach twist. "Why would anyone care about me?" I whispered. Nolan answered immediately. "That is the same question I have been asking." His voice lowered slightly. "Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. I will explain when I get there." The call ended before I could ask more. Slowly I lowered the phone. Vincent's polite smile never moved. "Everything all right?" he asked. "I am not sure. Life rarely gives us certainty." The answer sounded practiced. Too smooth. Too prepared. I folded the notice and slipped it into my apron pocket. I would like some time before making decisions. "Of course." His expression remained perfectly pleasant. "Take all the time you need." Yet something about his eyes suggested the opposite. He gathered his portfolio and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "One piece of advice. Miss Reed." I immediately disliked the sentence. "What is that?" His gaze lingered on me. "Not every act of kindness leads where you expect." Then he stepped outside into the snow. The moment the door closed behind him, Denise appeared beside me. I officially do not trust that man. I exhaled slowly. That makes two of us. The next hour crawled by. Every customer seemed to ask for extra napkins. Every coffee order took twice as long. Every minute stretched endlessly while I waited for answers. Finally, shortly after 1 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up outside the cafe. Nolan entered alone. The moment he stepped inside, I noticed something different. Not anger. Determination. He walked directly toward me. "Can we talk?" 5 minutes later, we sat at a small table in the corner away from customers. Snow drifted beyond the window. Nolan placed a file folder on the table. "Everything started after the ferry terminal." I nodded. "I figured that much." He opened the folder. Inside were copies of old photographs, newspaper clippings, community volunteer records. The dates stretched back decades. What am I looking at? Nolan picked up one photograph. It showed a younger Eleanor Mercer standing beside a temporary medical tent after a severe winter storm many years earlier. My mother volunteered in disaster relief programs for years. I studied the image. Eleanor looked exactly the same. Kind eyes. Gentle smile. Nolan continued. During one of those storms, she saved a teenager trapped in freezing conditions. I glanced up. "You." He nodded once. "Without her, I would not be here." The room became very quiet. I looked back at the photograph. At the woman sitting in the snow 2 nights earlier. The woman I had given my coat to without knowing anything about her. Nolan's gaze remained fixed on the picture. You did not just help my mother, Savannah. His voice softened. You helped the person who once saved my entire future. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Suddenly the photographs, the gratitude, and the strange intensity surrounding everything made a little more sense. Then Nolan reached into the folder and removed one final document. His expression changed. Again. Serious. Focused. And there is one more thing you need to know. My pulse quickened. What? Nolan slid the paper across the table. At the top was Vincent Hale's name. Beneath it was a list of properties. Every single building on my street. I stared at the document for what felt like an entire minute. Street after street. Property after property. Every address highlighted in yellow. Apartment buildings. Small businesses. Family-owned shops. Even the old laundromat near the ferry terminal where half the neighborhood washed their clothes. Vincent Hale owned them all. Or was trying to. This cannot be real, I whispered. Nolan remained silent for a moment before answering. Unfortunately, it is. Outside the cafe window, people walked through the snow carrying groceries and paper coffee cups. They looked ordinary, comfortable, completely unaware that someone was quietly buying pieces of their community one property at a time. I looked back down at the list. Why? Nolan folded his hands together. Influence. Control. Visibility. My stomach tightened. And me. His eyes met mine. You became visible. For the first time since this entire situation began, I finally understood. The coat. The photographs. The messages. The questions. None of it had happened because I was important. It happened because one small act of kindness had accidentally placed me in the middle of something larger than myself. I leaned back in my chair and released a slow breath. I never asked for any of this. I know. His answer came immediately. Then why are you helping me? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Nolan looked toward the snowy street. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. Because my mother spent years teaching me something I forgot. I waited quietly. She always believed that kindness creates responsibility. His gaze returned to mine. You helped her when nobody else did. Now it is my turn to help you. The words settled deep inside me. Not because they sounded dramatic. Because they sounded sincere. Hours later, after my shift finally ended, Nolan drove me home himself. The streets glowed beneath fresh snow. Small houses sat wrapped in winter light. The town looked exactly the same as it always had. Yet somehow everything felt different. Before I stepped out of the vehicle, Nolan handed me a carefully folded package. What is this? I asked. Open it later. That sounds suspicious. A faint smile appeared. It is not. When I finally reached the apartment, Caleb was sprawled across the couch pretending to study. You are late, he said. Again. I tossed my keys onto the counter. I am developing a reputation. A few minutes later, I carried the package into my bedroom. The paper unfolded easily. The moment I saw what was inside, my eyes widened. It was my coat. The same cream-colored coat I had wrapped around Eleanor's shoulders at the ferry terminal. Except now it had been carefully repaired. Every worn seam restored. Every loose thread fixed. The fabric looked almost new. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Then I noticed something tucked inside the pocket. A small photograph. On the back, written in Eleanor's handwriting, was a single sentence. Kindness always finds its way home. My throat tightened. I sat on the edge of the bed holding the photograph while snow drifted past the window outside. A week earlier I had been worried about rent, bills, and surviving another winter. Those worries had not disappeared. Life was still complicated. The future was still uncertain. Yet something had changed. One cold night. One elderly woman. One coat. And somehow the world had become larger than I ever imagined. As I looked at the repaired coat resting across my lap, my phone vibrated with a new message. It was from Nolan. Only 6 words. You changed more than you know. For the first time in days I smiled. If Savannah's story touched your heart today, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we hope to see you again in the next story. Because maybe the most powerful thing in the world was never money, influence, or status. Maybe it was simply choosing to care when everyone else kept walking.